Hey guys, welcome back to Cyber Platter. Today we'll understand risk management. In today's video, we'll learn what is risk management, what is its importance, risk elements. Risk elements are nothing but terminologies related to risk like asset evaluation, threat actor, threats, vulnerabilities, exposure, risk, everything. Okay. And then we'll learn about risk assessment or management process. What are the different types like quantitative, qualitative, and Delphi methodology? Quantitative risk assessment involves formula and we'll learn how that can be done to, evaluate what is the risk. And then we'll learn about risk responses, different types of risk responses like if there is a risk, how do you respond to it? Do you reduce it or mitigate it? Do you transfer it, accept it, deter, avoid, reject, or ignore? And then we'll try to understand countermeasures, that is, safeguards, how to select them and how to implement them. And then we'll learn about risk management framework. This was defined by NIST in special publication 837. We'll see what are the characteristics of this framework. We'll also see the steps included in this framework. Okay, then let's start. First, we'll start with what is risk management. So, security is nothing but all about safeguarding data and authorized access while preventing any loss or disclosure. The potential for data damage, destruction, modification, when I say modification, it is unauthorized modification or exposure is referred to as risk. Understanding risk management concepts is crucial for establishing strong security measures, governance, and demonstrating legal compliance. In maintaining a secure environment, risk management plays a vital role. So, what does this risk management involve, right? Risk management involves a detailed process of identifying potential threats to data, evaluating their impact, and implementing cost effective solutions to mitigate the risks. The overall risk management process helps develop effective information security strategies that support the organization's mission and objectives. The primary goal of risk management is to reduce risk to an acceptable level. However, what is considered acceptable can vary based on the organization, its assets, budget, and other factors. While it is impossible to achieve a completely risk free environment, significant risk reduction is achievable with thoughtful planning and efforts. It's important to note that risks to an IT infrastructure are not solely computer based. Many risks originate from non computer sources, so a comprehensive risk evaluation should consider all possible threats. IT security, which addresses logical or technical attacks, must be complemented with physical protections to safeguard against physical attacks as well. The process of achieving the goals of risk management is called as risk analysis. So, risk analysis involves examining the environment for risks, assessing the likelihood and potential damage of each threat event, evaluating the cost of countermeasures, and presenting a cost benefit report to the upper management. So, also something to note is that proper asset valuation is also very crucial for prioritizing and comparing risks with potential losses. So, in conclusion, risk management is a fundamental aspect of ensuring a secure and resilient environment. So now let's see the different risk elements. Risk elements refer to the key components or factors that contribute to the existence and assessment of risks within an organization or a specific context. These elements help in identifying and understanding the nature and potential impacts of risk. Let's see some of the common risk elements. First risk element that we'll discuss is assets. An asset refers to any resource, data, system, or component within an organization that holds value and requires protection. Assets can be tangible or intangible. Assets are critical to an organization's operations, reputation, and overall business success. Identifying and classifying assets is an essential step in risk management to understand their significance and potential impact of their compromise or loss. So there are different types of assets, like for example, informational assets. These include sensitive and confidential data such as customer information, financial records, intellectual property, trade secrets, and other proprietary information. Then there are physical assets. These are tangible items like computers, servers, network infrastructure, data centers, buildings, and so on. Then we have human assets. These are employees, contractors, and other personnel who contribute to an organization's success. Then we have software assets. This category includes software applications, operating systems, databases, and other software components critical for business operations. Then we have network assets like network devices, routers, switches, firewalls, etc. Then we have intellectual property, that is IP, which includes patents, copyrights, trademarks, and other forms of intellectual property that provide a competitive advantage to the organization. Then we have reputational assets. The organization's reputation and brand value are intangible assets that require protection from reputational damage. Then we have financial assets. These include monetary resources, funds, investments, and other financial assets. Another threat element we'll discuss today is threats. Threats refer to potential events, actions, or circumstances that can pose harm or damage to an organization's information, assets, systems, or data. Threats can come from various sources and may target different aspects of an organization's security, leading to potential risks and vulnerabilities. There are also different types of threats. They can be categorized into different types based on their origin and nature. Let's see some of the common types of threats. First one is cybersecurity threats. These threats originate from the digital world and include malware, viruses, ransomware, phishing attacks, and hacking attempts. Then we have physical threats. These involve physical damage to assets or facilities such as theft, vandalism, or natural disasters like fires and floods. Then we have human threats. These include insider threats, where employees or individuals with access to the organization systems intentionally or unintentionally compromise security. Then we have environmental threats. Environmental factors like power outage, extreme temperature, or electromagnetic interference can impact system reliability. Then we have legal and regulatory threats. Non-compliance with legal or regulatory requirements can lead to legal actions, fines, or reputational damage. Threats are often driven by malicious intent, seeking financial gain, competitive advantage, intellectual property theft, or political motives. However, not all threats are malicious. Some may be accidental or unintentional as well, such as human errors or system misconfigurations. Threats take advantage of vulnerabilities in an organization's infrastructure, software configurations, or human behavior. A vulnerability, which we'll discuss after this. For now, remember that a vulnerability is a weakness or gap in security measures that can be exploited by a threat actor. Threats can have varying degrees of impact on an organization. Potential impacts include financial losses, data breaches, operational disruptions, reputational damage, legal liabilities, and compromise of sensitive information. The threat landscape is continuously evolving as threat actors develop new techniques and strategies to exploit vulnerabilities. Organizations must stay vigilant and adapt their security measures to address emerging threats effectively. Another term you might want to know is threat agent. A threat agent refers to an entity or actor that carries out or has the capability to exploit vulnerabilities and pose a threat to an organization's information systems, assets, or data. Threat agents can be human or non human entities that intentionally or unintentionally engage in activities that can cause harm or compromise the security of an organization. Human threat agents are individuals or groups of people who intentionally engage in malicious activities such as hackers, cyber criminals, disgruntled employees, and insiders with malicious intent. Non human threat agents include software, scripts, bots, or automated malware that can autonomously perform harmful actions such as viruses, worms, ransomware, and other forms of malicious code. Okay, the next risk element that we'll talk about is vulnerabilities. Like I mentioned before, vulnerability is a weakness or a flaw in an organization's information systems, processes, or controls that could be exploited by threat agents to compromise the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of data or assets. Vulnerabilities can exist in hardware, software, configurations, or human behavior and pose potential risks to the organization's security. Software vulnerabilities are flaws or weaknesses in software applications or operating systems that can be exploited by attackers to gain unauthorized access or execute malicious code. Configuration vulnerabilities are misconfigurations in system settings, network devices, or security controls. Physical vulnerabilities are weak physical security measures such as lack of access controls. This can lead to unauthorized access to facilities or equipment. Then we have human vulnerabilities. Human errors, lack of awareness, or improper handling of data can create vulnerabilities that attackers can exploit, such as social engineering attacks. Vulnerabilities are typically exploited by threat agents such as hackers, cyber criminals, or insiders who actively seek to take advantage of these weaknesses to gain unauthorized access or cause harm. To mitigate vulnerabilities, organization must apply software patches and updates regularly, fix misconfigurations, and implement security best practices to strengthen their defenses. Vulnerability assessments and penetration testing should be conducted regularly to identify and evaluate vulnerabilities. There is something called as zero-day vulnerability. These zero-day vulnerabilities are unknown flaws in software or systems that attackers discover and exploit before the vendor or organization becomes aware of the issue. They pose significant risks as there may be no available patches or mitigations. Then the next risk element we'll talk about is exposure. Exposure refers to the state of being susceptible to potential asset loss due to a threat. It involves the possibility that a vulnerability may be exploited by a threat agent or event. However, exposure does not necessarily mean that an actual threat event resulting in loss is currently occurring. It simply indicates the possibility of a threat event or potential exposure. Exposure answers to the question of what is the worst that could happen. It doesn't imply that harm has occurred or will definitely occur, but rather highlights the potential for harm and its extent or severity. This notion is crucial in risk analysis, where we assess the quantitative risk value known as the exposure factor. We'll learn more about this when we are talking about quantitative risk assessments. By understanding exposure, we can proactively identify vulnerabilities and implement measures to mitigate potential risks. The next element that we'll discuss is risk. Risk is the possibility that harm may occur to an asset when a threat exploits a vulnerability. It involves assessing the probability or likelihood of a threat event happening. The higher the likelihood of a threat agent, the greater is the risk. Every exposure represents a risk. This relationship can actually be expressed in a formula, that is, risk is equal to threat multiplied by vulnerability. That is, if this is the threat and this is the vulnerability, then this portion is the risk. Therefore, reducing either the threat agent or the vulnerability directly leads to a reduction in risk. When a risk is realized, it means that a threat agent or actor or event has successfully taken advantage of a vulnerability, resulting in harm or disclosure of assets. The primary purpose of security is to prevent risks from materializing by eliminating vulnerabilities and blocking threats from compromising assets. Security acts as a risk management tool by implementing safeguards to protect against potential threats and vulnerabilities. Then the next risk element is safeguards. Safeguards are also known as security controls or sometimes countermeasures. Safeguards are measures taken to either eliminate or reduce vulnerabilities or protect against specific threats. These safeguards can take various forms, such as installing software patches, making configuration changes, hiring security personnel, modifying infrastructure, updating processes, enhancing security policies, providing better personnel training, electrifying perimeter fences, installing lights, and so on. Essentially, any action or product that lessens or removes the risk posed by a threat or vulnerability within an organization is considered a safeguard. It is essential to recognize that safeguards play a vital role in mitigating or removing risks. They are the primary means by which organizations protect themselves from potential threats. Importantly, safeguards need not always involve acquiring new products. They can also include reconfiguring existing elements or even removing certain elements from the infrastructure. The effectiveness of safeguards lies in their ability to strengthen an organization's security posture and minimize the impact of potential threats. By employing appropriate safeguards, organizations can proactively defend against risks and maintain a robust and secure environment. So, if you want to combine all these elements, threats exploit vulnerabilities. Threats exploit vulnerabilities, which results in exposure. This exposure, which is a risk, and this risk is mitigated by safeguards. These safeguards, which protect assets, and these assets are endangered by the threats. So threats exploit vulnerabilities, which results in exposure, which is risk, which is mitigated by the safeguards which protects assets, which are endangered by the threats. There are a couple of more risk elements. Let's cover them as well. Attack. An attack is when a threat agent exploits a vulnerability within an organization's security infrastructure intentionally. It involves any deliberate effort to take advantage of a vulnerability to cause harm, loss, or unauthorized disclosure of assets. An attack can also be considered as any action that violates or disregards an organization's security policy. Then we have the risk element breach. A breach occurs when a security mechanism is bypassed or defeated by a threat agent. When an attack combines with a breach, it may lead to penetration or intrusion. A penetration occurs when a threat agent successfully gains access to an organization's infrastructure by evading security controls, thereby directly endangering assets. So, in summary, an attack is the act of exploiting a vulnerability by a threat agent, while a breach refers to a situation where a security mechanism is overridden by the threat agent. A successful combination of an attack and a breach results in a penetration whereby the threat agent gains unauthorized access to the organization's infrastructure. Now, let's talk about risk assessment. This is also called as risk analysis. Like I mentioned before, it is the process by which risk management goals are achieved. Risk management and analysis are primarily the responsibility of upper management. Upper management defines the scope and the purpose, while the actual analysis is often performed by security professionals or an evaluation team. However, all risk assessments and outcomes must be understood and approved by upper management to ensure prudent care. In IT systems, risk is unavoidable and 100% elimination is not possible. So, the upper management should decide which risks are acceptable through detailed asset and risk assessments. Threats must be individually evaluated, and then there are two methodologies for risk assessment, that is, quantitative risk assessment and qualitative risk assessment. Quantitative risk analysis assigns real dollar value, that is, numerical values to asset losses, while qualitative assigns subjective and intangible values to the asset losses. A combination of both of these assessments is called as hybrid analysis, and hybrid analysis is commonly used to achieve a balanced view of security concerns in most environments. Okay, let's talk more about quantitative risk assessment. Like we mentioned before, quantitative risk assessment results in a report with dollar figures representing risk levels, potential losses, countermeasure costs, and safeguard values. This involves assigning a monetary value to each asset and threat, but it is not entirely adequate as certain elements of the analysis remain qualitative, subjective, or intangible. The process of quantitative risk analysis begins with assessing the value of the asset and then identifying threats. Once we know the asset value and identified all the threats, next step is to estimate the potential and frequency of each risk. And then this information is utilized to calculate various cost functions for evaluating safeguards. There are 6 phases, the major ones in quantitative risk analysis. Let's see them one by one. The first one is asset inventory and valuation. So first we inventory all the assets and then assign a value that is called as asset value to each of these assets. An asset value refers to the monetary worth or financial value assigned to an asset within an organization. An asset can be any resource or item that holds value and contributes to the organization's operations, revenue generation, or overall value, like we discussed before. Asset valuation allows organizations to prioritize their assets based on their importance and potential impact on the business. By understanding the value of assets, organizations can make informed decisions about resource allocation, risk mitigation strategies, and the development of protective measures to safeguard valuable assets. Okay, then the next step is research each asset and create a list of all potential threats. We are creating this list of potential threats for each asset, okay? And then calculate exposure factor and single loss expectancy, that is SLE, for each listed threat. Exposure factor represents the percentage of loss that an organization would experience if a specific asset were violated or affected by a realized risk or threat. It indicates the extent of potential loss to an asset when a particular risk event occurs. Exposure factor is typically expressed as a percentage ranging from 0 to 100%. A higher EF means that the risk event would result in a more significant loss to the asset. Let's say, for example, if an asset has an exposure factor of 30%, it means that the organization would experience a loss of 30% of the asset's value if the risk materializes. Exposure factor helps in understanding the potential impact of a risk event on a particular asset, and it is used in conjunction with the asset's value to calculate the single loss expectancy. So we mentioned single loss expectancy, that is SLE here, right? SLE is the estimated financial loss or cost associated with a single occurrence of a specific risk or threat affecting an asset. It is calculated by multiplying the asset value by the exposure factor for that particular risk. So the formula of SLE is equal to asset value, that is AV, multiplied by exposure factor EF. Let's say, for example, if an asset is valued at $50,000 and the exposure factor for a specific risk affecting that asset is 25%, then the single loss expectancy would be calculated as asset value, that is $50,000 into 0.25, that is equal to 12,500. SLE helps in quantifying the potential financial impact of a risk event on a specific asset. Okay, in the first step, we got to know about the assets and their values. And in the second step, we identified the threats and the exposure factor and single loss expectancy of each list of threats. Let's go to the third step now. Third step is to perform a threat analysis to determine the likelihood of each threat occurring within a year. Okay, this is known as ARO, that is annualized rate of occurrence. ARO is a metric used in quantitative risk analysis to estimate the expected frequency or likelihood with which a specific risk or threat will occur within a single year. It represents the probability of a particular risk event happening annually. ARO is typically expressed as a decimal or a percentage. A higher ARO represents a higher likelihood of the risk event to occur. We're talking about the risk event occurring more frequently throughout the year, okay? While a lower ARO value suggests a lower probability of the risk event happening. So for example, if there is 5% probability for a specific risk per year, then ARO is equal to 0.05. Now we have the asset value and inventory, then we have the exposure factor, single loss expectancy. In the third step, we're calculating ARO. And in the fourth step, we calculate the overall loss potential per threat by determining the ALE. ALE stands for annualized loss expectancy. This is a metric used to estimate the expected financial impact of all instances of a specific realized threat against a particular asset within a single year. It represents the average annual cost of the potential losses resulting from a specific risk event. ALE is calculated by multiplying SLE, that is single loss expectancy, by the ARO value, that is annualized rate of occurrence value. For example, suppose an organization has identified a specific risk event that could lead to a $10,000 loss for a critical asset, then that $10,000 is the SLE, and say that ARO for that risk is calculated to be 0.05 or 5% probability per year. So then ALE will equal to $500. This means that on an average, the organization can expect to incur losses of $500 per year due to this specific risk. Now that we know the ALE value, the next step is to research countermeasures for each threat and then calculate the changes to ARO and ALE when applying a countermeasure. Now let's see how to calculate ALE with a safeguard. This involves determining the financial impact of a specific risk on an asset both with and without the safeguard in place. So first, what do? We calculate the pre-safeguard ALE. Like we mentioned before, that is calculated using the existing exposure factor and annualized risk of occurrence. So ALE is equal to SLEs into ARO. In turn, that is ALE is nothing but exposure factor into asset value. So this is the formula. Then what do? Once we calculate this, we identify and implement the appropriate safeguard. This is to reduce the likelihood of the risk event occurring or to mitigate its impact. Then we determine the post safeguard ALE. So after applying the safeguard, recalculate the ARO, that is annualized rate of occurrence, and any necessary changes to the exposure factor specific to the safeguarded asset. So once we got the new ARO and if there is a new EF, calculate the new ALE, annualized loss of expectancy for that asset, considering the reduced ARO and possibly modified EF resulting from the safeguards implementation. In most cases, the exposure factor remains the same even with the safeguard. This means that if the safeguard fails, the loss on the asset would likely be the same as with without the safeguard. However, in some cases, a safeguard may still reduce the damage even if it fails partially. The primary purpose of a safeguard is to reduce the ARO. A successful safeguard should decrease the frequency of the risk event occurring, ideally reducing it to zero, but practically most safeguards are not perfect and they may only lower the ARO, not eliminate it entirely. Once we have the post safeguard ALE and ARO value, the last step is to perform a cost benefit analysis of each countermeasure for each threatened asset and to select the most appropriate response for each threat. Now let's see how to evaluate this safeguard cost. To assess each specific risk, you must analyze various safeguards or countermeasures based on their cost effectiveness. Firstly, create a list of safeguards for each threat and assign a deployment value to each of these safeguards. The deployment value represents the cost of implementing the safeguard compared to the value of the asset it aims to protect. The value of the asset sets the limit for the expenses on protection mechanisms. Security measures should be economically viable, meaning you shouldn't invest more in terms of finances or resources to safeguard an asset than its value to the organization. If the cost of a countermeasure exceeds the asset's value, it is more reasonable to accept the risk. Calculating the value of a countermeasure involves considering various factors, including acquisition, development, and licensing expenses, implementation and customization costs, annual operational maintenance and administrative costs, costs of repairs and upgrades over time, impact on productivity, that is potential improvement or loss. Then we have environmental changes brought about by the safeguard, costs associated with testing and evaluation. Once we have this potential safeguard cost, we can then assess the benefits of implementing the safeguard within the organization's infrastructure. As I mentioned before, the annual costs of the safeguard should not exceed the expected annual cost of asset loss due to the identified risk. Once we know the safeguard cost, one of the final steps in this process involves calculating cost benefit ratio or cost benefit analysis to determine whether a safeguard is a financially sound investment while improving security. So this is how we calculate it. Value of the safeguard to the company or the organization is equal to pre-safeguard ALE minus post-safeguard ALE minus annual cost of the safeguard. Let's call this ACS. So the value of the safeguard to the company is calculated using pre-safeguard value minus post-safeguard value minus the annual cost of the safeguard. If this result is negative, then the safeguard is considered not financially responsible. However, if the result is positive, it represents the potential annual savings the organization may achieve by deploying the safeguard, since the frequency of occurrence is not a guarantee of actual occurrences. While annual savings or losses from a safeguard are essential considerations, they should not be the only factors when evaluating safeguards. Legal responsibilities and prudent due care must also be taken into account. In some cases, it might be more sensible to incur expenses on a safeguard to avoid potential legal liabilities resulting from asset disclosure or loss. So these are the 6 steps in quantitative risk analysis. First is we calculated the asset value. Then we determine the exposure factor, which is a percentage value. And then we calculated the SLE, single loss expectancy, using the formula asset valuation into exposure factor. Then we determine the ARO, annualized rate of occurrence value. This is the frequency of the risk to occur per year. And then we calculated the ALE value, annualized loss expectancy, that is equal to SLE multiplied by ARO. And the next step is to calculate annualized cost of safeguard per year. And then we calculated the value or benefit of a safeguard by using the formula ALE1, that is pre-ALE, pre-safeguard ALE, ALE2 post-safeguard ALE minus ACS, that is the annualized cost of safeguard. The countermeasure with the most positive resulting value from the cost benefit formula would be the most economically viable choice to deploy against the particular asset threat combination. By evaluating safeguards, through this analysis, organizations can prioritize cost effective measures that provide a strong return on investment in terms of risk reduction and enhanced security. Okay, so this is about quantitative risk analysis. Now we'll talk about qualitative risk analysis. This focuses more on scenarios and subjective evaluations rather than precise calculations. Instead of assigning specific dollar values to potential losses, it involves ranking threats on a scale to assess their risks, costs, and impact. It is nothing but, as the name suggests, it assesses risks in a qualitative manner, meaning it involves subjective judgments and descriptive measures rather than precise numerical calculations. The primary focus is to understand and rank risks based on their potential impacts, likelihood of occurrence, and overall significance to the organization. Risks here are often ranked on a scale of high, medium, or low. Various techniques are employed in qualitative risk analysis, such as brainstorming sessions, focus groups, surveys, interviews, checklists, one on one meetings, questionnaires, storyboarding, and Delphi techniques. These techniques help gather information, insights, and opinions from subject matter experts and stakeholders. The choice of which technique to use depends on the organizational culture and the nature of the risks and assets involved. It is common to utilize multiple methods simultaneously and compare their results in the final risk analysis report provided to the upper management. So, one of the techniques that I mentioned is a Delphi technique used in qualitative risk analysis. This is a less familiar approach compared to the other methods that we mentioned earlier, like brainstorming, questionnaire, etc. This involves an anonymous feedback and response process to facilitate a group's consensus anonymously. The main objective is to obtain honest and unbiased input from all participants. Typically, participants are gathered in a meeting room where they provide feedback on paper without revealing their identities. The responses are compiled and presented to the group for evaluation, and the process is repeated until a consensus is achieved. All in all, both quantitative and qualitative risk analysis approaches yield valuable outcomes. However, each method employs a distinct approach to evaluate the same set of assets and risks. To exercise prudent care, it is essential to utilize both techniques in combination. This ensures a comprehensive assessment of risks and assists in making informed decisions and implementing effective risk management strategies. The next topic is risk response. Risk response refers to the actions taken by the organization to address identified risks and their potential impacts. The selection of a risk response strategy depends on factors such as the risk's severity, the organization's risk appetite, available resources, and the specific nature of the risk. Let's see the types of risk responses. First one is risk avoidance. This strategy involves taking actions to eliminate the risk or prevent it from occurring. It may include discontinuing a risky activity, not pursuing a certain project, or avoiding exposure to a hazardous situation altogether. Avoidance is most suitable when the potential consequences of the risk are severe and the cost of managing or mitigating the risk outweighs the benefits. Another type of risk response is risk mitigation or reduction. This involves taking actions to reduce the likelihood or impact of a risk. This strategy aims to control the risk and minimize its negative effects. Examples of mitigation measures include implementing safety protocols, enhancing security measures, diversifying investments, or conducting regular maintenance to prevent equipment failures. Then we have risk transfer or assign. This involves shifting the financial consequences of a risk to another party. This can be achieved through insurance, outsourcing, or contractual arrangements. By transferring the risk, the organization reduces its financial liability if the risk materializes. For instance, businesses often purchase insurance policies to transfer the risk of property damage or liability to the insurance company. Then the next type is risk acceptance. Sometimes, the most appropriate response to a risk is to accept it and its potential consequences. Acceptance can be active or passive. Active acceptance involves creating a contingency plan to avoid the risk if it occurs. Passive acceptance, on the other hand, means acknowledging the risk without implementing any risk response actions. This approach is typically chosen when the risk is minor or when the cost of other risk responses is not justified. Then we have risk deterrence. This refers to the use of proactive measures and strategies to discourage potential threats or adversaries from exploiting vulnerabilities and attempting to carry out harmful actions. The goal of risk deterrence is to create an environment in which the perceived costs or consequences of taking a risk or engaging in harmful activities outweigh any potential benefits, thus discouraging potential attackers or individuals from pursuing harmful actions. Example of risk deterrence include visible security measures like surveillance cameras, security personnel, warning signs, or having a robust security protocol which can deter attackers by making it difficult for them to breach security barriers or exploit vulnerabilities. When I say robust security protocols, it can include strong authentication measures, encryption, regular security audits, incident response plan, and so on. The last type of response is risk rejection. This is an unsuitable and unacceptable approach to dealing with risks. It involves denying the existence of risks and adopting a passive attitude, hoping that the risks will never materialize. However, such a response is not valid or prudent when it comes to risk management and due care. Ignoring risks and refusing to address them can leave an organization vulnerable to potential harm and negative consequences. Effective risk management requires acknowledging risks and taking appropriate actions to mitigate, transfer, or address them responsibly. So, these are the different types of risk responses. Now, we'll see what is a residual risk. After the implementation of countermeasures, the remaining risk is referred to as the residual risk. The residual risk consists of threats that are specific to certain assets for which upper management has chosen not to implement safeguards. In other words, residual risk is the risk that management has accepted instead of mitigating. In many cases, the presence of residual risk just indicates that the cost benefit analysis showed that the available safeguards were not cost effective in deterring the threats. Total risk represents the level of risk an organization would face if no safeguards were in place. Total risk can be calculated using a formula. It is a combination of threats, vulnerabilities, and the asset value. The difference between the total risk and the residual risk is known as the controls gap. The controls gap represents the amount of risk that is reduced by implementing safeguards. So, residual risk is calculated using the formula total risk minus the controls gap. So, how to implement the countermeasures and what are the different types of countermeasures like administrative, physical, logical, or deterrent, preventive? All that I have a different video which talks about in depth about these. So, I will link it in the description if you description box if you are interested. The next topic we'll refer to is the risk management framework. This is defined by the NIST in special publication 837. This provides a structured approach for managing risks associated with information systems and organizations. It is a comprehensive framework designed to assist federal agencies and other organizations in protecting their information and information systems from various threats and vulnerabilities. RMF consists of 7 main steps, each representing a distinct phase in the risk management process. The first step is prepare. In the prepare step, organizations lay the groundwork for the risk management process. This involves establishing a risk management strategy and ensuring that key stakeholders are identified and engaged. Additionally, the organization defines its risk tolerance and objectives, establishing roles and responsibilities for risk management, and allocates necessary resources for implementing RMF effectively. Then the next step is to categorize. Here, the organizations identify and categorize their information systems and assets based on their criticality, sensitivity, and impact levels. This categorization helps in determining the appropriate level of security controls needed to protect the systems. Then we have select. In the select step, organizations choose the appropriate security controls that are aligned with their risk management goals and the categorized information systems. The selection process involves assessing and customizing security controls based on the organization's specific requirements. The next phase is the implement phase. This involves putting the selected security controls into practice within the information systems and organizational processes. This step includes designing, developing, and deploying the necessary security measures. Then the fifth step is to assess. During the assessment phase, the effectiveness of the implemented security controls is evaluated. This includes conducting security assessments, tests, and evaluations to identify any vulnerabilities or weaknesses that may exist. Then the next one is to authorize. In the authorization step, based on the results of the assessment phase, the organization's senior management makes a risk-based decision regarding the acceptance of the risk associated with the information systems. If the risk is deemed acceptable, the information systems are authorized for operation. Then the last phase is the monitor phase. The continuous monitoring phase involves ongoing assessment and observation of the information systems and their security controls to ensure that they remain effective and responsive to changing threats and vulnerabilities. So these are the 7 phases of RMF. Actually, RMF is designed to be flexible, scalable, and adaptable to various organizations and system types. It promotes a risk-based approach to security, allowing organizations to tailor their risk management efforts according to their unique circumstances and needs. This framework emphasizes a life cycle approach to risk management, encouraging continuous improvement and adaptation to emerging risks and challenges. So, this is about risk management. So, we learned what is risk management, what are the risk elements like threats, vulnerabilities, exposure, risk, safeguard assets, asset value, and then we learned about the risk assessment, different types, quantitative and qualitative. A combination is called as the hybrid. Then in quantitative, we learned how to calculate the asset value and then the single loss expectancy, the formulas involved in this, exposure factor, and also we learned about ARO, annualized rate of occurrence, ALE, and then how to research countermeasures, how to define the countermeasures, how to implement them, cost benefit analysis of the countermeasure, which countermeasure fits your organization better. And then we also calculated the value of the safeguard, how should we select it, it. And then we learned qualitative. In qualitative, we learned a little bit more about the Delphi technique, which involves anonymous feedback and response process. Then we learned about the different risk responses. What are the different types? Avoidance, mitigation, transfer, acceptance, deterrence, and rejection. Then we learned residual risk and total risk, how to calculate them, the formulas for those. And then finally, the Risk Management Framework RMF by the NIST Special Publication 837. What are the seven phases of this and how it can be used for your organization? So that's it for today. I will see you in another video with another topic. Until then, bye bye.